So SQL it is for this course, but what does this mean for us? It first of all means that we need to create a SQL database. And the great thing here is that with Django, if you create a new project, like here that blog project we worked on a couple of minutes ago, you typically automatically get a DB SQLite free file created. And that already is a SQLite database file, which is pre-created for you without you installing anything special. So you don't need to install any extra tools or any extra servers or software or anything like that. This is a database which basically can be created on any system. And Django should have created such a file automatically for you. If it didn't, you can create a new file and simply name it DB SQLite free. Now, I'll not do it here because I have that file already, but you can simply create such a new file if you don't have one created automatically. Now, that is SQLite free. Other implementations like MySQL need to be installed first. The reason for that is that SQLite is a very simple SQL implementation which simply works on a single file. That's great for development and also for many websites which don't have that much traffic. But if you're building a website which has more traffic and which might need to run more queries against the database, you might need better performance than you have when you're just working on one file. And then you might need to set up a dedicated database server, which simply offers better performance and so on. And that's where a solution like MySQL could come in handy. And that's why you also need to install it, because it's not just a single file against which you write queries, but instead this is now a full database server which you set up, which simply gives you better performance and so on. Now, for development, and as I said, also for many live production-ready websites, we don't need that though, because SQLite doesn't have too bad performance either. And you can visit the SQLite homepage to learn more about it. And there you will also find the When to Use SQLite article, where you can learn more about when to use it and when you should think about switching to a different database implementation. So that might be interesting as well. So we need to install a database, or in the case of SQLite, create that file. And then we can run SQL queries against that database by using certain tools. More on that in a second. For example, we can then create tables and set the table schema, so the structure of that table, with a command like this. That's how the SQL syntax looks like. And this is a command we could run initially when we're getting started with our website to set up the database structure. To add a new table named books in this case, which has 3 columns, an ID, a title, and a rating column, where we then also assign certain value types and settings to those columns. Because that's important, when you're working with SQL, you don't just have rows and columns, but instead you also define which values should be stored in the different columns. So you really define a rich schema describing the kind of data that should be stored in a table. And you do this once when you initialize your database. So that's a command you could run to create a new table with those fields, with those values and settings. For the ID field, you see that besides the value integer, we also have primary key and auto increment settings, which basically just means that this field should be auto-populated whenever new data is entered in that table, and that it should be an auto-incrementing ID, which is also unique in the end. And we're going to take a closer look at the different fields we can set up throughout this section. This here is just a rough overview. So that's a SQL command we might need to run initially when we set up the database. Then, once it is set up as part of our website or application we're building, we might need to insert data into the table, so into the database. And in SQL, that insert command typically looks something like this. Insert into, then the table name, then pointing at the columns where we want to insert data, and then the values for those columns. In this case, Lord of the Rings as a string, so as a text, because that's the type we set for the title column. And then 5 as a value for the rating, 5 as an integer value, because that's the value we set there. I'm not setting the ID because of auto increment primary key. that will be auto-populated, and it's an auto-incrementing number. And of course, then at some point in our website, we also might need to get data from a table, maybe also with a certain condition set. And then that's how the SQL syntax would look like. Select star from books simply means select all columns, so all values from the books table. And then where rating greater 5 means for the rows, so for the entries where the rating column has a value greater than 5. So these are some example SQL queries. And if that's a bit fast, there is a reason for that. Because we are not going to write those queries when using Django. Because Django thankfully has a built-in feature called models, which allows us to work on data on a higher level, so that we don't have to write those low-level SQL queries and commands, but that we instead can describe what we want to do with our data. For example, that we want to save data or delete data, and then Django will automatically create those queries under the hood and execute them for us on our behalf. And that's very convenient because that means that we don't need to learn a new language, this SQL query language here, but that instead we'll be able to focus on Python and working with Python data. So let's take a look at this models feature then.